everybody. Welcome back to the gallery. Super exciting episode today. We're going to talk about how to find entrepreneurs, where they are in the wild, how to get them to join a studio, how to get them to understand a studio, all that good stuff. So we have Amanda Poole joining us today. Amanda's been around the block. She was at High Alpha. She's at a new studio now. Before I try to give a broken intro, I'll let her handle it. So Amanda, thanks so much for joining. Tell us who you are and what you've been up to the last X number of years.
Well, thanks for having me, Jake. I've been in the startup studio space for about 6 years, working in startup talent for over a decade. I spent most of that time at High Alpha. Startup studio started in Indianapolis, but now builds companies all over the U.S. And I had the opportunity to work in their core studio team, on their innovation team. I even spent a little bit of time dedicated to one of their portcos that had just raised a monster round and needed some help scaling quickly. Excuse me if I'm out of breath. I'm very pregnant. I'm like 9 months pregnant. But my time
You sound great.
largely,
You're doing great.
thank you. It's my lungs are fighting for space here, but most of my time has been largely focused on founder recruiting. So in the past 6 years, I've actually had the opportunity to contribute to launching over 50 portfolio companies. And I've recruited almost up to the 100 founder mark. So once those founders are on board, I've also spent time advising those CEOs and stuff like headcount planning, their comp philosophy, equity distribution, building their initial teams, and then actually supporting the internal firm development as well. And I just recently joined the DVx team, which I'm super excited about, to work on their founder recruiting as well.
Awesome. I feel like this role has been wildly undervalued, underrated, and underutilized across studios. And I remember I began forming that opinion probably 3 years ago, where I looked around and, I was at a studio from 2017 and we had multiple people in place whose full-time job was you have to go get coffees with founders all day, every day. Like that's your job. Meet founders, get to know them, have a pulse on what's going on in the community. We always need to be the nucleus of like, what are people up to? Who's on the market? Who's about to exit? Who's like considering starting something new? And then who can be potentially convinced otherwise? Why do you think that this role is so undervalued? And you look around at most studios and like, maybe they have a head of platform or maybe they have somebody who is in charge of finding EARs, but like, in my opinion, that should be a partner. Like that's a partnered role. What's going on there?
Yeah. I think that I felt that way in the past as well. And my understanding has changed to evolve to the point where I'm a little bit more generous with it now, to think of, why are we all motivated to be running venture studios is because we can create the companies that we want to invest in and put those like 3 key ingredients together, which is a great idea timed at the right time in the market, a phenomenal founding team, and then the right check. And so what I've observed is that partners and studio founders, they actually put so much credence on the talent piece that they themselves want to execute. And so instead of having somebody whose sole job it is to think through this, they think, oh, you know what? I'm going to use my network. My network's super important to me. This is one of our key ingredients. And so like, I kind of need to control that. And then on the journey that I've witnessed is it takes some period of time for them to realize that this needs to be something that somebody who is a high level leader, who is waking up thinking about this every single day. I'm still super involved. I'm still making those same decisions, but at this level and not this level.
Yeah. Here's a historical question. So let's think like the years 2016, 2017, 2018. So, more than half a decade ago. Most people, almost everybody had never heard of a studio, and you had the same job then as you do now. But now everyone has at least heard of a studio, knows what it is, and can name 10 studios off the back of their hand. How did your pitch and your process go, 5-6 years ago? And how is it going today of just like, you meet someone in the wild, identifying that they could be a good founder, and get them in to have a meeting. What was that like?
Yeah, that's such a good point. The conversations that I have today are wildly different than the ones at the beginning. Still tons of education that needs to happen up front though. At the back in 2017 when I started recruiting founders, I'd say that most of the onus is like, what is it like? What's the idea of a venture studio? Versus today, it's more
Yeah.
so credentializing my firm and what type of venture studio we are.
Hmm.
So, I mean, you
Hmm.
know better than anyone, and I've listened to some former gallery episodes that have dived into this. But there's a spectrum where sometimes studios are looking for founders with ideas, they're looking for founders with theses. Others are bringing them in at the idea phase. Others are bringing them in once they've reached product market fit. So that's the good news is that we're able to go from 101 to 201 because I don't need to explain what a venture studio is. I can explain who we are in that landscape.
Are you finding that the founders that you're meeting now are just higher caliber or lower caliber when it comes to potentially bring them into the studio than it was half a decade ago?
Yeah, it's hard to say because I look at founders who I worked with back in 2017 who have now successfully exited, and to say that they are not high
Yeah.
caliber would not be correct. But I would say that
Yeah.
looking at the backgrounds that they brought to the table and the resumes that they brought to the table, this where we sit today, I am very oftentimes working with really, really accomplished, impressive former founders with exits. Where before the venture studio model was established and some of the data has come out about our success, I think that former founders thought, oh, you know what? I've got access to capital. I can figure out an idea. I'll start doing some exploration. And I don't really need the help of a team around me. So this doesn't sound as appealing. Versus now, I'm definitely working with many, many more former founders who say, oh, yeah, all that's true. Studio model still makes a ton of sense for me.
I believe there's this mindset when a new studio is emerging and
Mm-hmm.
they are starting to talk to potential LPs, they need to present, well, here are the companies that we're going to be starting. Here are the entrepreneurs that we're going to be starting them with.
Yeah.
I think any new studio GP and potential LP would agree that, like, how else would you raise for a studio if you can't demonstrate, well, these are the companies you're going to be investing in, and here's a look at the entrepreneurs that we are going to actually be building them with. So with your new studio and with other new studios out there, how do you suggest new GPs go from 0 to 1 of like, okay, we want to start a studio and now we need to demonstrate to potential investors that, like, these are the entrepreneurs that we're going to be building our first few portfolio companies with?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would be curious how much GPs before they write a check want to dive into the nuts and bolts of the background of founders. I personally have not seen GPs want to see to that level before writing a check,
Mhm.
but what
Okay.
they want is confidence because that's again like our whole thesis with the startup studio, or I'm sorry, venture studio, is that we're able to control that piece and put this
Yeah.
idea in the hands of the most qualified founders. But my contrarian take on this is that I think that's again like too in the weeds, where like as a GP, if you're like reviewing resumes of a founder or like that's you probably shouldn't be writing a check into that venture studio if you feel that you need that degree of control, because there's an issue with pattern matching too.
Okay.
So if I were to say we're only going to start with former founders who've raised at least X number of million from institutional VCs who've had X number of exits, we're going to miss some really great talent. We could also say we're going to only start companies with people who've got domain expertise. And like oftentimes we found that's actually the wrong thing to do. So I think it depends how tight your thesis
Yeah.
is, and it depends on the level of control that your GPs want. But I would say that that's pretty granular.
I feel like when you, this is almost, it's very anecdotal, but I feel like when you look at the world of venture and then within that, there's the subset of the world of studios, a lot of folks mention like well, of course we pattern match. Like that's how this business works. And that's the tendency that everyone falls into. Most people fall into. But then they like to brag about how they find a diamond in the rough and like how, we find these founders in like these unexpected places. It's always the one you
Yeah.
least expect. Really curious, like have you found more successful EIRs, entrepreneurs through the pattern matching approach or through like some act of the universe they just landed in our lap and it was totally random and they were completely outside the pattern? And then which of those has been more successful?
Yeah, yeah. I would say it's, and this is like nothing new. I wish I was adding more uh, to the dialogue here, but it's actually talent begets talent. So a huge difference in the conversations I'm having between 2017 and 2023 is that I work with an amazing founder, and then they know other amazing founders that they were co-invested in. They saw at the CEO offsite from a former funder, things like that, and they're my best advocates to introduce me to new talent. Um, but yeah, so
Yep.
then that's part of the reason I have a contrarian viewpoint with the pattern matching is you could take a look at even just the exits for companies that I've been involved in recruiting the founders with. And I actually did this to demonstrate to a partner where they said, hey, like you said, like these are things we should be looking for. This person is missing this thing and this thing. Why should we hire this person? And I looked back at our exits and I'm like, oh, like each of these individuals looks pretty different on paper, but yet we're successful. So I think oftentimes people want the people side of things to be a science rather than an art. And I think that everyone needs to get a lot more
Yeah,
comfortable with the fact that it's a lot more of an art than a science.
I love that. It's now inspiring me to get into sort of the nuts and bolts part of the conversation if
Yeah.
you're up for it.
Yeah.
So let, I mean, tell us about like some of the places, circumstances. I'm just really curious. Like, take me back to the moments where you've met the best. I mean, the introduction, the best founders that have been most successful. Did you run into them at a conference? Did you, get an email intro? And then from that, I'm curious, almost like as a guide or a blueprint for a new studio who's emerging, and they want to create a strategy of like, this is how we're going to get 5 new amazing world class founders a year. Where do they start? Like, what's their strategy for how they can highest leverage meet the most possible best founders as fast as they can?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. So my take on this is that the conference, the trying to like magically meet founders who are ready for their next entrepreneurial venture is a really, really tricky thing to time. And you can spend a lot of time and a lot of money that doesn't actually pay dividends. So you're much, much better suited off
Mm,
making that your long-term goal once you've established an employer brand and that people know who your studio are. And those conversations are going to happen a lot more naturally. At the beginning,
yeah.
you've got to actually be probably a little bit more surgical about it. And so, my what
Mm,
at High Alpha, what I ended up doing was working to build a team that looked a lot like uh, the business design team, where it started with an analyst, where we would have a concept that came
mm,
out. And the very first thing that I would need to do is make sure I am very, very well versed on what we're trying to build, on the structure of it, and then work with an analyst where I'd say, hey, like, I need you to go map this market and tell me, like, what companies have been built here. So, a good example of this would be if we're building an ag tech company. We built a company a few years ago in the carbon credit space. And so I say to the analyst or sourcer, this could look like a bunch of different people, but an analyst probably already lives in your startup studio. And what they should have done in the ideation process is they should have looked at the competitive landscape. They should have looked to other types of companies that have sold into the customers that is the same go to market strategy as us. So I say that analysts like go and tell me, give me a list of these companies. I'm going to then go and look for the individuals who worked early on in those teams and then be able to start understanding the space. So I can be like, oh, okay, like this company raised around about this time, this person was here. And then I can infer like, oh, this is somebody who's done what we're going to be asking them to do of it. And then I'll just do a cold reach out.
mhm.
So to all of that being said, That's been really, really successful before you start having an employer brand. High Alpha has now been around long enough that they've got an amazing employer brand. So they're leaning way farther into like network, community, trying to be in the right place at the right time. And that's more effective today than it would have been back in 2017.
Yeah, it's great. The element of treating it almost like a funnel and a pipeline, as any deal sourcing mechanism would be at a fund, I think is actually quite unique. I've looked at this point hundreds, maybe even thousands of decks for new studios when they're raising their first fund, and usually it's like a $3 to $7 million fund.
Yeah.
And probably 70% of the time, somewhere in that range, there's no slide, there's no information on how are you going to get founders consistently every quarter, every month, whatever it is, to build startups with.
Right.
And then more importantly, how are we going to know they're great founders? They just either don't think about it or they leave that out completely. And it's jarring, for lack of a better word. It's shocking that that conversation isn't being had enough with studios, and when you're launching a new studio, to like not even realize that that's an important piece. Okay, fine. So it's our job here to now like shine a light on that, use a megaphone, and make it very clear. This needs to be front and center, probably more important than highlighting like these are the companies we're going to be building. It's because it doesn't start with that. It starts with the human behind them.
Right.
But then there's the other 30%. And I'm now really curious to get your opinion on this, which is of the 30-ish% that do go really deep and tactical on like, here's how we're going to methodically and repeatedly bring founders in, and like, here's our funnel. I've seen so many different versions of it. And I think that actually largely speaks to the brand of the studio itself. I'll share an example. There's a studio I worked closely with. I'll give them a shout out, Purpose-Built Ventures.
Yeah.
Founded by Miles Lassiter. I'm sure many people know of Purpose-Built or know Miles. He's really active. One of the coolest guys I've ever had the pleasure of working with in my career, let alone in the studio world.
Yeah.
I love their approach because they put, more than any other studio I've seen, an enormous amount of emphasis on human performance. And that means a lot of things. But in his case, it means we're going to not only find great potential founders, we're going to then turn them into world-class entrepreneurs and CEOs. So we bring in coaches, we bring in therapists, we do offsites and bonding and all these different scientific-like mechanisms to nurture and grow and really, 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 really invest in our founders. And so one, that's great marketing, because if I'm a founder who's like, maybe I haven't had a big exit yet, but I'm good, I'm young, whatever it might be, I'm like, wow, I really like that. I want that for me. I'm going to go to Purpose-Built.
Right.
I'm going to work with them. And it's also great for obviously their quote unquote bottom line and their returns, because you're able to get in lower and sell them for higher. Like you're the building trees, not from seeds. Like that's an amazing thing to do. So, but then I've seen every other approach under the sun, which is like, we go to corporates and we pull people that are ready to build a startup, or we go to, former professional athletes and we turn them into entrepreneurs. Like there's all these models. How did you develop yours? Like, how did you land on, well, this is the one that's going to work for High Alpha, and like, that's what we're going to do?
Yeah, that's funny. It's interesting to hear more about Miles' approach, because I really admire that, because I think that you have to know thyself as a studio and know, what am I trying to build and where are my resources invested? Like that is your studio operating budget, and you're spending it on therapists and offsites. Yeah. And if that is the best use of your time, absolutely do it. And I would imagine that some of Miles's thesis is that I can actually create more investable founders than exist out in the market by funneling these investments in. So I think that's really important. Totally. And I would, and sorry, Miles, I don't know you if you're watching this, but I would guess that if you looked at the diversity of founders in his portfolio, it might be higher than the average studio, because he does not need to bring somebody in who's fully credentialized. He can actually like work with them to create an amazing founder if they've got all the building blocks to do so. That's one type of thesis. I would say that another thesis could be that we don't invest. That's not part of our studio budget, is to augment our founders or create founders. We're looking for already competent founders who've done this before and we've got proof points. And so we may be supporting them in different ways. So there's some studios whose services look a little bit less like that and look a little bit more like, we're going to get you services at cost. We're going to help you with your business development. We're going to help you attract investors. And so I would say, like, in my experience, that's probably more of the approach that I see, is like, as much potential as you have, I like, part of what I'm trying to do is work with the best founders and their needs. And because of that, you need a certain level that I'm not committing to teaching you. I'm committing to writing you a check and providing these services, which is not necessarily creating you into a great entrepreneur. And then the most extreme version of that, here at DVx, we actually don't bring our CEOs in until we've already reached product market fit. So they look quite different than the founders that I worked with at High Alpha, where we're not necessarily indexing for the builders, we're the builders. And so we've gotten the companies to a point where we're like, okay, great, you need to be a scaler now. And so had I hired a scaler at High Alpha, what we would have done is they would have really, really struggled at the beginning in that 0 to 1 phase. And then you take a builder, put them in scaling, they may hate that. And then, of course, there are those certain diamonds of individuals, like the founder of DVx, John McNeil. He started and exited to significant exits, like 6 companies. So there are people exist who can do both. But it's, first of all, know thyself as a studio. Are you creating entrepreneurs? Are you working with entrepreneurs? And if you're working with people who have already done it, are they builders or are they scalers? Or do they need to be both?
Sure. I'm going to get a little bold here and talk about a topic that needs to really be addressed a lot more, and this is diversity.
Yeah.
You already alluded to it, so let's get into this one.
Yeah.
I've been struggling with this since we launched the gallery, where I'm thinking, all right, I need to hand select a great group of people who have been successful in this space and can speak about this space and highlight them and put their face on the website and talk about the studio model.
Right.
First order of business was, well, it can't be all men and it can't be all white men.
Yeah.
And it should not be, for many reasons. And then look at my site. That's what it was, because it's like, well, crap. I now go out to the market and that's 95, 99% of the people in the studio world. And I'd rather share some voices than no voices at all. So it's like, I'm in this really challenging dilemma. And then if you look at it geographically, I think I don't know the exact data on this now, but I believe it's more than 50% of studios are in Europe, in the whole world. Like over half of all the studios that exist are in Europe.
Yeah.
And look at those studios; they're almost all their leaders and almost all of their teams are white men. How do we change this? Where are we today? Yeah. Where do we need to be tomorrow? And how are we going to get there?
Well, first, I'm glad to be your first lady host or your first female interviewer, but you're right. This is a tough subject for me too, because oftentimes at conferences or in situations like this, I'm looked to as like, why hasn't startup studios solved this diversity issue? We look at what's happened in the conversation that was just happening about the legislation passed in California. This is a nut that the venture community has been trying to crack for a really, really long time. So as a woman in this space, I've got to be a voice to impact the ability to build more diverse teams and invest in more female and underrepresented founders. But as also the person who's largely responsible for delivering that, I can really see why we're at where we're at. Where part of what I commented on when you brought up purpose-built studios is that they have the ability to potentially create and mold founders who have all the potential in the world. And so what's important about what I'm about to say is to say that I do not believe that white men are more naturally suited to start companies or be more well qualified. However, based on what the way society has run to this point, they are the ones who have largely been granted those opportunities. And so when you are a startup studio responsible for investing the dollars of your LPs, um, uh, and be a good steward of that and fulfill your obligations, you need to be investing in the best of the best founders. Oftentimes, that does mean looking for a certain set of experiences, and those experiences have largely not been given to women or people from underrepresented backgrounds. So that's, to me, that's the big disconnect, is we cannot create founders unless that's part of our budget. So if LPs write checks into studios whose purpose is to take people with great potential and make them great founders, that's a great way to solve this issue. What is an unrealistic thing to do is to be an LP, write a check into a studio and say, have all these standards for the type of people that you write checks into, and then be surprised when those people don't necessarily look like people from underrepresented backgrounds, because we know that venture dollars have not traditionally gone to these people. So how can I bring you a multi-time founder who has raised significant venture dollars and start a company with them? Because the pool just doesn't exist.
Yeah. How do you think that, well, I'll rephrase. You look around the startup studio community, it's pretty male dominated and whitewashed. Look around the LP community, it's like way worse. So how do you think LPs need to be looked at here, repositioned, held accountable, whatever the right phrasing is? How can LPs help with this effort? And then how can the studios put them in that position, educate them on the opportunity, lead by example in a way to even attract LPs that can write checks in the first place that do have this mindset?
Yeah. I mean, I would say LPs who are writing checks into VCs who invest in underrepresented groups they should take a look at startup studios. And I would like to see more startup studios, rather than just traditional venture funds, work with underrepresented founders because of everything that we just talked about. I think it comes back to knowing thyself. Like, if you're an LP and your main motivation is strictly a return, and you're going to show up to the board meetings and then ask questions about the diversity of founders, it's not to say that no one should be held accountable, and these conversations do need to happen, but you need to understand the systemic reasons as to why the funding environment looks the way it does before trying to hold your studio accountable. So that's my 2 cents. And it's actually okay. I experienced this with our innovation team at High Alpha, who actually builds studios with different entities. And one of those entities is Notre Dame. And that university, as we were raising the fund for that studio, we found that they were absolutely motivated by returns. This is a venture studio. However, much of the motivation for the LPs was actually like, hey, I want to contribute to this ecosystem. It was a lot more kind of philanthropic, mission driven than it was just like, hey, let me know, like, I'll show up and let me know how the fund is doing, type of thing.
Yeah. Do you think that has become more demanded and widely accepted in recent years, where it's almost a mandate versus just a nice to have?
It's hard to say. It depends on when you ask and which board meeting you're at. But I think like we've got to not ever lose sight, like, as an asset class, that this needs to be a well-performing asset class before it does anything else. But you can achieve multiple things at the same time. Yeah. And so as an LP, know thyself. Why am I writing a check into this? Do I want to do something where I can move the needle in increasing the diversity of founders? Or am I going to kind of hold the GP accountable to things that might be inverse to that goal? And if so, just know where you're writing your check into.
I'm a white male. One can see that. What can I do better in the gallery with the studios I work with? How can we improve here from your perspective?
Yeah, I think asking these questions, and it's been really refreshing to have this conversation with you in a way that it's safe. Where I think that it's really hard for everybody having this conversation to feel like we need to get it
Yeah.
perfect 100% of the time. When in reality, when we're talking about
Mm,
issues like diversity in many other topics, if we're holding ourselves to the to perfection, then we're much less likely to go deep in the conversation and say what needs to be said.
mm,
Right? Like the easy thing for me
love
to
that.
do would be for me to come here and be like, we need more diversity, and there's no excuse for it, and girl power, and that's it. But we're able to have a conversation where it's a little bit more nuanced than that, where we should be doing better and we need to have these conversations. But we can also talk about some of the systemic reasons that, as one institution, as one individual, we can't change.
Yeah, yeah. I love, and we can kind of sum up this element of the conversation here. But I love the mindset of don't hold ourselves to perfection because it's almost like too high a bar where we end up doing nothing.
Yeah.
Let's start somewhere. And I
Yeah.
also really love this call to, if you're someone who can write checks or have some sort of influence over innovation, right? Whether you write checks or you like connect people or you build or whatever it is, studios are potentially a really good vehicle for this, to enact change, to have progress, because you can build and nurture founders and help them grow versus you're just out there looking for the ones who are already representing what you're seeking. Build them
Right.
instead of look for them, which is the like core ethos of studios to begin with. That's why studios really began. So I love that framing of all of this. I'd love to circle back a bit to some stuff we were talking about earlier on, which was more on the
Yeah.
tactical side. Let's imagine a conversation. It's like your third or fourth conversation with a founder that you're having, probably over Zoom or in a boardroom. You start getting into the nuts and bolts of a deal. What are questions that they're coming at you with that you feel you need to be really well equipped and prepared to answer? So if you put yourself in the shoes then of a new studio GP, and they want to like feel really prepared to go sit down with a world class or soon to be world class entrepreneur and grapple with the questions of like, all right, how much equity are you going to take from me? Like, what are the exit clauses? What does the waterfall look like? How is this going to look at Series A, at Series D, at IPO? How is the studio going to change? Like, what are the questions you're being asked, and how do you like to work through those questions?
Yeah. And I'll even just like talk a little bit about the journey of getting to that conversation, which is the transparency
Even
from the
better.
beginning is super helpful in these conversations, to be respectful of your time, of their time. In treating these conversations as if you're going to work with the best of the best founders, this needs to be a bi-directional interview. And much of what we're talking about can be a filter. So that way we're not
Mm,
selling. We are two equals trying to figure out if this can make sense. And so I think that's really important to approach it that way versus like, hey, I'm going to hold this back because it's, maybe something that's more nuanced, needs more context. So I'd say have the conversations up front. So we start very heavy on the candidate education at the beginning, and then ramp that down over
mm,
the process, and then our assessment ramps up throughout the process because now we have given them the foundation to know about the studio model, about the concept. And so I can go way deeper with you to see if, like, do you understand the board controls? But I would say this is where that meaty middle where you said they should really understand who are your board members and who's got control, and understand why that is. They should understand the way their cap table looks today, what runway that gives them based on what we're trying to accomplish. And then when they need to go out and fundraise, they should know the expectations of what to expect from us as a studio. And so for me, that's one of the most important things, is giving a really, really clear upfront expectation. Because what I don't want is to have sold you a dream, and then here we're 6 months in and you're like, hey, Amanda, like you said that you guys were going to like get me like these like great, you had customer number one and I haven't met them. That's just going to create a disaster for us. And then at that point, the company's going to die because we've already burned the money and the idea. I would say the things that you as an entrepreneur should be assessing your studio against are just making sure you really understand control rights, you understand your cap table, you understand what you're getting from the studio. Are you paying cash for that? Or is that part of their equity stake? Because many studios do charge for services. Are you betrothed to those services, or are they optional? What can you expect as far as like support when it comes to the things that can kill your business, which are like going to market, getting revenue, building your product, and then of course fundraising. And so if you understand those things in and out, it should be your goal as the person recruiting that founder to make sure they're super, super well educated. So you're starting in a foundation of shared understanding, and there's no surprises later.
Yeah, I love the mindset of be transparent. Like this is very two-way. How did you phrase it? It was like it's a bi-directional interview. I love that.
Yeah.
And we see so many founders playing this mindset of, so many studios and GPs playing with the mindset of like, you're playing VC here. VCs they play poker, right?
Yeah.
It's a game of poker. You don't reveal your cards, and you need to make certain bets and say certain things you do at the right time. You want to make founders sweat so that they like keep burning money before they take your deal. And then you get a better deal. You want to like play the leverage game and the signal game. And would you agree that some of that's needed to an extent, but it's actually, in order for a studio to succeed long-term, that game shouldn't be played. This should be more of a authentic type of relationship game. It's a very challenging one to work through, even because it's like, it's human to human. It is sales at the end of the day. It is business, but like, it's just a different flavor on it than we've seen before in the VC and startup world.
Right. And I think it depends on like, as an investor, what your experience is like there. So if you're a late stage investor and, like I feel like when Tiger was writing a bunch of checks, like their commitment was like no commitment. Like we may or may not take a seat on the board, and you're going to get a check. And then that's as much as you're going to hear from us. You look to earlier stage investors, and oftentimes their promise is like, we're going to be in the trenches right there with you. We're going to work alongside of you. And so, again, it's just all about expectations. As a CEO, I might want Tiger's check because I want people out of my hair, and I don't want that level of support. So in the studio model is like, that should be none of us. Like you shouldn't be starting a studio if that's what you want to do something else. If you're in the studio world, you are going to just end up like, if you're playing this game of like, oh, I think I can actually get them for like X% instead of X%. One, you should look across your portfolio. You're probably cross-pollinating your founders. And if they're sitting around the fire at your CEO offsite for the year and they're comparing their cap tables, that's not going to end well for anybody. The second thing, and this is something that's I don't like to breathe too much into some of the critical voices around studios, because I think that's been amplified to just get sound bites. But you have heard where the question comes like, oh, what does this cap table look like for follow-on investment? And you're establishing what a company that comes from your studio should look like out in the market. And so if I, as a Series A investor, I've seen like 3 things from this studio and they all look pretty different to me, that's not going to reinforce my confidence. Having said all that, in every institution I've worked at, no deal is exactly the same. And there is context and there is nuance, but fighting it out over like a couple more percentage points is really not the thesis of the studio. The idea is I want a well compensated and motivated founder who's got a great idea and the runway they need to accomplish what I need them to.
Yeah. What conversations or questions are not being asked these days on this topic in general that you think should be asked, or conversation that should be had? What needs to come next, in your opinion?
I think that I'm grateful for voices like yours in the space, because one thing that has been not helpful to the studio space as a whole has been the convolution of what a venture studio is. Um, to me, just getting as much religion around that as we can, to say that a venture studio ideates companies, funds those companies, and supports those companies, and is not an accelerator, is not an incubator. That's really helpful, because when we're measured against different setups, then of course it's going to look super inconsistent to the market. So I think that one is just like the industry needs to really understand what is a venture studio. But then two, the problem with that is that there is nuance, right? Where we talked about some studios are working pre-idea. Some are founding the companies from scratch with a founder and just handing them an idea and a check. Others, like the one I'm working with now, we're more of the Sutter Hill model, where we're operating to a point and then bringing in a CEO once we've established. So I think that that's really the education that keeps me up at night when I think about the future of the venture studio space, is people understanding really, and using the correct definition, so that way we can be judged and compared appropriately.
Totally. This is great. So we're getting kind of close on time. We'd love to hear, how can people get in touch with you? What's your call to action with the studio you're with now? And where do you want to leave off?
Yeah. Well, thank you. This has been fun. For me, I would love to speak to anybody who is interested in becoming a founder, that is interested in the venture studio model. Spend a lot of my time doing, like we said, targeted outreach. We're being kind of surgical about, this is what we're building and this is what the best profile looks like. But talent begets talent. So I love to talk to anybody interested in the model. And even if it's not necessarily with DVx, we've got a really strong community. And so I can oftentimes be helpful pointing them in another direction if it's maybe not something that we can work together. And then lastly, I would offer that if there's anyone who has an offer from a venture studio, or who wants to talk through something that they might feel uncomfortable with, I would be happy to walk through it with them and say this is why this looks like this. This is an outlier to me. Things that they might want to consider as they review those offers.
Awesome. Love it. And where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I Twitter a little bit, and you can reach me at Amanda@DVx.Ventures too.
Awesome. Amanda, thank you. Really awesome conversation. This was, I think, one that needed to be had for me in general, but also I think for the whole space. So really appreciate you coming on to share your thoughts and kind of get into the weeds of this one. And we'll certainly chat again soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jake.